May 20th was Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and we were invited to sit down with a member of the team at Ghost Pattern to talk about the importance of accessibility features in video games, how far we've come, and how far we still need to go in the area.
I'm Cameron. I'm a accessibility consultant as well as a programmer and composer from New Zealand. And I recently just started work as an accessibility consultant on a game called Wayward Strand. Global Accessibility Awareness Day is an annual day that was started, I think, 10 years ago, where the idea of it is to raise awareness of accessibility. It was started for web, I think, but it has branched out into games and stuff like that as well. And basically the idea behind it is it's fairly decentralized. People set up events to discuss accessibility, and it's sort of a way to what's the word for it? I don't say it's a wrap around it, but
spread awareness?
Yeah, spread awareness around it.
So in terms of video games in general, like, accessibility features are a thing that has been kind of on the rise, but I feel like a lot of people still don't quite understand what constitutes an accessibility feature, because there are plenty of people out there that you say accessibility feature and they're like, oh, easy mode, and that's really not what it is. So can you explain what exactly accessibility features are and, like, generally what they do?
People have disabilities. It's just a thing that exists. Basically, a lot of games, the design of them can inadvertently stop disabled people from really being able to play them. Basically, what an accessibility feature is it is a feature that helps mitigate the impact of a disability with playing games. So, for instance, players that have motor-related disabilities might struggle to hold a button down for an extended period of time. An example of an accessibility feature would be turning that into a toggle. So, if you have to hold down a button to sneak around, an accessibility feature toggle for that would be to just let it play and press the button to start crouching and sneaking around, and press the button again to stop, so they don't have to hold the button down the whole time.
Yeah, and you see that in a lot of, especially AAA games are starting to do that with, like, run buttons and stuff. There's also stuff like colorblind modes for people with, like, red-green color blindness. It kind of, if it's a game that's going to be impacted by their disability to see those colors apart, then obviously putting in a mode for that is a way to make it easier for people like that.
There are games out there that have puzzles that are solely dependent on color, for instance, and if that is the case, someone who is colorblind will struggle greatly to get past that.
Recently I played Ekenfell, which is an indie RPG that came out last year, and it has a lot of accessibility features, actually. Stuff like making the timing in combat easier, or just eliminating it altogether. So I mentioned Ekenfell, obviously. I think a big AAA game that actually, despite my personal feelings on it, did a very good job with accessibility features, which was Last of Us Part 2. So they are very on the rise. Are there any other notable implementations that you've noticed in, like, recent times?
In the AAA space, Ubisoft seem to be doing quite a good job of it. Microsoft and Sony as well. Especially Microsoft and Sony. They have really upped their work in that field in recent years.
So like you said, the big three, for the most part, seems to be starting to embrace these. Nintendo not so much, as much as other people for the most part.
Yeah. Nintendo tends to be really hit and miss from what I've found. Like, sometimes
they're still very old-fashioned.
It's unfortunate because Nintendo do tend to more skew towards family-friendly games, and, like, with them being the major console manufacturer that is lagging behind in accessibility. Like, it does give disabled children less stuff to play.
And on that note, like, do you think that there would be any way to sort of incentivize Nintendo to do so, even if it's just like go on Twitter and say, hey, you guys should really start looking into this more often? Like, I guess at the end of the day, it would generally just be like going to them and trying to, like, filling out surveys, because they send out surveys quite often, and just making sure that's something that is put into like any suggestions for something we could do better, etc., etc.
I mean, that would be one way to do it. Nintendo have always kind of been a company that have done their own thing, and like don't really give in to external pressure that much.
For better or for worse.
For better or for worse. Often for better, but this is one of the few cases where it is for worse.
So, something that I was actually asked by the rest of the NWR writing team, they asked me to ask you this. Would you have any advice for game journalists that want to know what to look for and how to cover these kinds of features? And basically something along the line of, is there somewhere we can go? Is there something we should know? That kind of thing for when it comes to covering how games handle this.
The unhelpful answer would be to research accessibility. There are a lot of great sites out there for that, such as Game Accessibility Guidelines, and Xbox have a pretty good set of accessibility standards that they have publicly available as well. What else you could do would be to reach out to disabled journalists who are good at covering this kind of stuff and seeing if they would be interested in
sort of collaborating about it. Do you know of any resources or any of advice you could give to, because you are working on Wayward Strand, which I assume is a relatively small team, being an indie.
Yeah, it's a small team.
Do you have any advice for like another small team that's working in the indie space about figuring out accessibility features that they might really benefit from including in their games? Like we mentioned the colorblind mode earlier for games that have very color-based puzzles and stuff like that. But not every game is the same. And like the kind of feature that a platformer might need is not really the same kind of feature that a point-and-click adventure might need.
I do have a few sets of advice for that kind of thing. I guess the first piece of advice that I have is to try and start working on accessibility as early as possible. If you do start working on making a game accessible like at the start of it, you can then factor that into the design of your game and the gameplay of it. If you make certain choices early on, it is easier to make the game accessible later. And also, it is a lot easier to implement a feature with accessibility in mind than it is to retroactively add accessibility to a feature, just because it is a lot more work to fit additional functionality into an implemented feature than it is to implement it with everything you want to do in the first place. Also, I know that getting a dedicated accessibility person onto a project can be quite pricey. And I know that a lot of indie devs have small budgets and money is really tight. So in that case, there are plenty of great resources to look at. So I already mentioned Game Accessibility Guidelines and Xbox Accessibility Guidelines. Those are two resources to check out. Just remember that, if you can only partially, you can only do some things to make your game more accessible, it is better than doing nothing. So, for instance, if your text size is too small, but increasing it to a size that would be expected, it just breaks your dialogue system, then it is better to increase the text size a little bit than it is to just leave it where it is.
Basically, some is better than none, essentially. This is a subject that I am very interested in, as not only I have family that is disabled in certain ways that would benefit from accessibility features in video games, and also as somebody that hopes to get into making games at some point, I feel like this is a subject that until very recently was being overlooked in general in the industry.
I wouldn't say we're at the point where it's like there's still ways to go, but as far as accessibility goes, we are definitely in a better position now than we were 5 years ago.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's just something that needs to be shoved into the light a bit more, because even outside of like a humanitarian thing, it also just comes down to, well, I mean, if more people can play your game, you make more money on your game. Like, it just makes business sense too, if you think about it.
That is another piece of advice. If you can get your accessibility information out earlier, that is better, because if someone knows that they can play your game like months in advance, then it means they're able to get excited about it.
Yeah. And again, more eyes on, especially on indie games, is never a bad thing.
It can be a way to get attention. Like, I know that when that Can I Pet the Dog Twitter page came out, there were a lot of games that suddenly included petting dog mechanics just because they wanted that feature on that Twitter page, because they know a lot of people look at it. Like, there are people that want accessible games, and if you can show that your game is accessible, then people will take notice.
And that about covers it. Thank you for sitting down to have a chat with us, Cameron, and you can check out the game that his team is currently making at waywardstrand.com.